here, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank Helen for giving me an opportunity to talk about my work, and it's been going on for a long time now, on people who left their small towns and went to Greenwich Village in the early part of the century. So I want to thank you for that, and I also want to thank the artists who are sitting there on the stairs, particularly because what you've done is to really bring back people whose lives have been forgotten in the midst of time in many ways, and put them on the walls here, and we are able to now start re-engaging with them fully, and I'm very happy that you did that, and thank you very, very much for that. That's important for me. So what are we going to start with? What are we going to do? I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. I have so much to say, and I've been trying to cut, but I'm going to try to move quickly through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and take you with, and to give some historical background to some of the paintings that you see on the walls. So before we do that, we first have to do some things of who were these people? And I like this quote, particularly from Susan Glaspell, who says, most of us were from families who had other ideas, who wanted to make money, played bridge, voted the Republican ticket, went to church, thinking that everyone should be like everyone else. And what they are doing is leaving their small towns and coming and looking for other people like them. So in general, the people we're going to be talking about were born in the 1870s. They were native born in a country that is now was seeing more and more immigration, but they were native born people, they called them. They were Anglo-Protestant families. They would have called themselves from Anglo-Saxon families, but we would probably today call them Anglo-Protestant. They were from middle-class backgrounds, and by that, that's such a vague term, doesn't mean too much, but what I'm trying to indicate is that they were not from the social elites of the time, nor were they from the impoverished sector of the society. They were in that middle sector that was sort of susceptible to changes in economic conditions over the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th. And most of them lived in small towns as children, and as adults they wanted to be writers or artists or rebels, just plain rebels. Okay, so what were they rebelling against? They were rebelling against Victorian views, Victorian values, and that was a term they would use. And by that they meant the constraints and really the surveillance that went on in small town life, the religious beliefs, the Rock of Ages, not only being certain faiths, but also just the belief that there were truths that you could easily see and access. Gender norms, they were rebelling against women being in the domestic sphere by them alone. Sexual restraint. Mrs. Grundy was the butt of a lot of jokes. Mrs. Grundy is the sort of the prude. And the drive for financial success. That's what they wanted to get away from. But why does it matter for us to try to understand them? Well, first of all, that they're products of the 19th century, not the 20th century. So what they're doing is struggling to rid themselves or to loosen up the Victorian values that they grew up with. And they're also living in a country that is still run by law and by custom these same Victorian values. So they're struggling within themselves and against the world that they live in. They are also beneficiaries, and we could even say representatives of what I'm going to call the dominant social order. In 21st century parlance, I could say the white hegemony of the United States, but I'm using domestic, the social order of the time. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that this is a rebellion from within the dominant social order at a time when the entire U.S. society was also feeling pressure, cultural pressure, economic pressure, social pressure from other groups who are outside the dominant group, right? So you have immigrants coming in, they're bringing new cultures. That's a real shock. You have the radical labor organizing and the striking that's going on. That's the working class, the industrial working class, fighting against the order. And you have the blacks from the South coming in and transforming some of the cities in the North, particularly New York and Chicago. That's changing, but these are from within. They're also saying no. And with that, because they did grow up as part of the dominant social order, they also assume that they have a leadership role in change. And so they are going to actually believe that they can change the world with their ideas. And that's really important to them. And they think they can change the world through their conversation and through their artistry. So let's look at a few that we may know. First is Mary Heaton Vorse. Under her is Neath Boyce. And on my right is Susan Glaspell. And they call themselves the Regulars. They live in New York, usually in Greenwich Village, and they come down and spend their summers, usually late May, June through September in Provincetown. And so on the side you see the name of the person, when they came to Provincetown, and where they lived. And one of the interesting things to me is when you start to actually map where they lived like in a block. And those of you who live in Provincetown can even, help us even understand this better. It's like 2 feet down. They're seeing each other all the time. First person I want to bring up is Mary Heaton Vorse. And if you've been to the Vorse house and you've seen pictures of Mary Heaton Vorse, you think of her as an older woman. And I want to think about her as a younger woman. And she was born in 1874. She lied about her age constantly, but that's the right date. She was born in New York, but she grew up in genteel Amherst. And she hated genteel Amherst and wanted to get out as a teenager. And she did what a lot of people would do, is she went to art school in Paris, and then came back and went to art school in New York City. And after a couple of years of that, she came slowly to the realization that she was really a very mediocre artist. And she would never make money doing that at all. So she did sort of the next best thing, so she didn't have to go back to Amherst. She met a man named Albert Vorse, who she thought was a bohemian writer, some 9 years her senior, and she married him in 5 weeks. And that kept her going. And what she found out very soon, that he was a writer but not very skillful. He really had difficulty writing. He couldn't sell his work, and he was a serial philanderer. And she learns this at the same time that she has her first child, Heaton, in 1901. So she doesn't know what to do. So the couple, she thinks, well, I'll take the family and we'll all go to Europe because it's a lot cheaper than living in Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village. So to save money, she went to Paris and then the next year to Venice. And she hoped that this would really change Vorse, that he would have time to focus on his writing and he would be who she thought he should be. But it didn't really work. And so she blamed herself. And she said she was too demanding. She was too needy. She didn't forgive him enough. And she decided that she was going to be perfectly good. That was her words. And a couple of years later, 1906, she's still being perfectly good. And she came to Provincetown to see her half-brother who was studying art there. And she came with Bert and the baby, and they loved it, and everyone sort of knows the story of Mary falling in love with Provincetown, and she did. And the next year they came again, and they saw a house. And she describes the house like this, and this is my interpretation. This house at 466 Commercial Street is really a description of how she feels about herself. So it had that untenanted and miserable air of a house whose people had died and left abandoned. For this old house was not merely closed, it was a home going begging. The front windows with crooked shutters, askew, seemed to peer out into the world, seeking for a family to make it live again. So she's trying to she buys this house with her money because she's the only person who's earning through her short stories, her lollipops. They buy it, and she has hope. And she has hope that Bert is now going to sort of take, as a homeowner, is going to take control, and he's going to write, and it's going to be good. And it sort of works for a couple of months because he now writes on all of the papers, this is the estate of Albert White Vorse. And he builds a fence around this dilapidated house. And he has the front room, he takes the front room and remakes it for himself. A front room at this time in American sort of house history is the room that you give just to visitors. It's supposed to showcase the family, its culture, its values. And so Bert is very happy. He takes the front room. And he says, the front room was Bert's room. He arranged the furniture, chose the wallpaper. He built the bookcase in the corner. He bought the fine, heavy, homemade cherry table that seemed to belong there. And at auction, he bought me the homemade pie cupboard. The desk was his, and the big chair. The room has different pictures, but in essence, it has never, ever changed. It is as Bert planned it. All right, so again, she decides that she's going to be very, very good. And she is going to really curb her ambitions to write and her ambitions to go out in the world and see the world. So here is their house. This is a more modern pictures of it. But in 1908, when she's doing this, they bought the house, they're fixing it up. He's now setting himself up publicly as the writer, and she is being very good. She has another child in 1907, and she is going to curb her ambitions. It doesn't really work. Because the awful summer of 1908, these are her words. She is in the house, being very good, and she suspects that he is having an affair. So she goes to the young boy next door and asks him to take her out in the wagon, and I think she calls it the wagon, so I think she means a horse and wagon, over the dunes to see if she can find him. And she gets there, and he comes out from a dune with her stenographer. Okay, and that is the end of Mary Heaton Vorse's really feelings for Vorse, though she stays married to him. She starts to not think about him. She starts to think about fixing up her boat, her sailboat, and learning how to sail and set sail on the bay and feel free. In 1910, he dies. Bert dies. He dies in a hotel. He dies in a hotel room in Staten Island. No one knows why. He's alone. And she's free, but she's now free, and this house, which was his, is now hers to take care of. She's got 2 small children. She's got a nanny. She's got a stenographer, hopefully a new one. And that's what she's going to, it's really having a tough time financially. And she will have a tough time financially her entire life. But here's the moment. In 1911, she meets Joe O'Brien. And Joe O'Brien is a reporter for the Boston Herald. And in February of 12, she goes with him to Lawrence, Massachusetts, to the textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. They want to cover it and report it. And some main thing happens to her, 2 really important things. One, she falls in love with O'Brien, and she's going to marry him in April. But she also gets in touch with radical labor organizers from the industrial workers of the world. And she's going to be friends with some of them for her entire life, and it's going to transform the way she sees the world. Up until this point, she has thought about the poor that she's lived near in Greenwich Village as exploited, but she thought that people would change and help them if they only knew the problem. And it's in Lawrence, when she sees the militia, armed militia against women and children, that she realizes that's not the way it is, and that she's going to have to fight. So her world as a labor writer, what she does is she actually goes to strikes and writes the publicity for the labor organizations for the rest of her life. And then she meets Joe. And Joe is a man who actually wants her to have ambition and supports her. And he comes to the house, and he actually remodels the house to suit them. So these are excerpts from her time in the town. So the house had run down in 1910 and 1911. She didn't have any money. She was frantic. Automatically, Joe straightened out the house as he straightened out my life. The affairs of the house hummed along well under his hand. The house began to shine. Soon we had a garden and chickens. They have a baby, Joel, in February of 1914. And then she says the house was rich in children, not only hers, but the neighbors' kids. And there was a sense of living and growth. And then he did something really wonderful. he remodeled the back of the house. He put on an L, and he transformed what she called a malignant back kitchen into a child's playroom. And so Joel gives her what she has wanted all along, which is this: someone to go out into the world and bring back new things, someone who will, like me, to go out in the world and bring back new things. So with that, I wanted to look at The Door to the Bath by Paul Schulenburg, because this area that Paul is painting now is what was the malignant kitchen that was transformed into the playroom. And what I love about this, besides what looks like a shadow of Mary Heaton Vorse looking over, is that it captures three things that she has always wanted: life-giving with the flowers, light, and of course a window to go out into the world. So so that's our first painting. The second person I want to talk about, I want to just introduce you to, because we don't have time to go into her life. It's a very interesting life. She's also a short story writer. She also is a novelist. She's married to Hutchins Hapgood, who's also a fairly famous writer at the time. And most of their lives, of their 45-year-old marriage, they debate how to have a happy marriage. What is a modern marriage? He wants to remain a lover, that means having many affairs, and bring it back to the primary relationship. She wants to remain herself and to keep her identity as a writer, as also being a mother and a wife. So the struggle between these people for all these years, I think, is really, on the surface it's about fidelity. Under the surface, I think it's about intimacy and autonomy, and how can you have both? And how can you struggle to have it? And they don't have an answer. They just have negotiations. But for our purpose, she pours out her emotions and her thoughts, and sometimes her anger and snide remarks, in her work. And her work generally is prose, but when she gets to Provincetown, she starts to have a little fun and wants to play and write one-act plays. And her very first play is called Constancy, about fidelity. And it's performed in her rented house at 621 Commercial Street. And this is the very beginning, the first night of the Provincetown Players that many of us know about and have heard about. And tomorrow is the anniversary of that performance that she and Joe O'Brien performed together. It's a dialogue of two people. And right after the night, she writes back to her father-in-law and says, "You'll be amused to hear that I made my first appearance on stage." Well, the stage, she is on the veranda of her cottage, and her friends are in the living room. All right? But here's the important thing that I think is for us to hold on to. I've been stirring up the people here to write and act some short plays. She has been erased from the history of the Provincetown Players, and she is one of the very first, and it took place in her house. So I want us to keep her in mind and maybe get back to her. Oh, and the first play that they did together, Hutch and me, was performed the next year, and it was called Enemies. Okay. And now we get back to Susan Glaspell. Susan Glaspell was born in Iowa, in Davenport, 1876. She's the younger person. She goes to Drake College, graduates, goes to Des Moines as a reporter, then goes to Chicago and works there writing novels. But she's really drawn back to Davenport. And why is she drawn back? It's because she is in love with a married man, George Cram Cook. His nickname is Jake. It was a nickname his mother gave him, so I'll call him Jake. So he is now scandalized at Davenport because he was a college writing professor. He gave that up to become a truck farmer. His wife divorced him. While he's waiting in the waiting period for that divorce, he plans to marry a 19-year-old girl. And while he's planning to marry her, he's starting a relationship with Glaspell. So they marry the 19-year-old and Jake. And she has her daughter in 1908. And Glassville keeps coming back to Davenport, going to Chicago, coming back to Davenport. 1910, Molly Price, who's the girl, has her second pregnancy. She's pregnant. And finally, Jig Cook says, no, I'm going to marry Susan. And they have a 2-year waiting period, and they can't stay in Davenport because what they've been doing is just so non-Davenport that he goes to Chicago for a short time. She goes to Greenwich Village to write, and they meet in Provincetown where she's been summering. Okay. When they go to Provincetown, Jig is fairly floundering because he's a teacher with no students, he's a writer who doesn't write, and he's a leader who doesn't have a following. And he doesn't have anything until around 1915, when there's a little theater movement going on in the American cities, particularly Chicago, where he was, and then in New York. These are people who get together and create little theatrical communities and put on plays. Some of them American plays, some of them new plays, some of them old plays, but that's what they're doing. And it's becoming a thing. And for Jig, that becomes a calling. He is now going to transform American theater. And he's going to have it based on American experiences. And he's going to inspire new playwrights. And he's going to inspire new writers. And damn it, he's going to actually build the theater on a wharf in Provincetown, almost by himself, owned by, Mary Heaton Vorse and Joe O'Brien. So this is a photo. This is a photo of the wharf, and the larger building is the fish house that Jig almost makes by himself. So Jig is a really good talker, apparently, and good drinker. Really good drinker, really good talker. He's not so good a playwright, and he's known as a sort of really so-so actor. So in 1916, the second year, when they're now in this fish house that they've called the Wharf Theater, they need some plays because they're asking for subscriptions and they want to get money to keep going. And he needs some plays. So what does he do? He says to his wife, Susan Glassville, I've announced a play of yours on the next bill. And she says, but I don't know how to write plays. And 10 days later, it's in production. She says later in an unpublished memoir, I didn't want my marriage to break up, so I wrote trifles. All right. So later on, even further, she says, I gave up practically everything, though I had an established position as a novelist. She gave herself to realize Jig's dream, both before his death in 1924, all through his period at the Playhouse. He was a leader, he was the president, she supported him, and then went off to Greece and lived with him for 2 years in the mountains of Delphi in Greece, because he wanted to live the shepherd's life. But she wrote trifles for him. And I want to just think for a minute about that one-act play that before, has anyone seen Trifles? You've seen Trifles? Okay, it's a one-act play, it's about a half an hour. Before the play begins, a farmer has been strangled in his bed, and his wife, Minnie, has been taken to jail. And as the play begins, the play starts in this gloomy farmhouse, probably Iowa or Midwest, and it's cold and winter and dark. And 5 people come in, 3 men who are there, a sheriff, a prosecutor, and the farmer who found the dead body. And they're coming to look for evidence against Minnie. They want to find out what happened here. And the women come, the sheriff's wife and the farmer's wife come also, and they're going to gather some things for Minnie to bring to the jail for her, some clothes. And the men start mocking as they tramp up and down the stairs looking for this evidence. They mock these women who are talking in the kitchen, and they're saying, oh, you just talk about trifles. And what they're talking about is, well, gee, did she sew the pieces that she's using for this quilt, or did she knot the pieces? The men think they're just too unimportant to deal with. Of course, what's happened is that very soon the women start noticing the trifles, those small things, are clues to what happened. So one of the things that happen, they see bread that has been put away, they see unwashed pans, and they see a bird cage with the door really off its hinges. And they think it's like someone has, the line is, someone has been rough with it. And then they start to say, oh, I'm thinking about things in my life when something rough was done to me. And Mrs. Hale, who was played by Glasspool in the production, that's the farmer's wife, says, I know how things can be for women. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. So they start talking about themselves, and very soon they discover a dead canary wrapped in silk. And when they see that, they put together all the pieces of the quilts, and they realize that this woman who's been living with a man who has been rough with her has now knotted her quilt and killed him. But then they have a question. What do they do with this information? The men who want to bring Minnie to justice are going to bring her to a trial where there will be no one to understand how things can be for women. So what do? They look at one another, eye to eye, and they take that canary and they drop it in the bucket. And that's the end of trifles. So now we go to Mary Alice Eisenberg's painting, which we have. I'm so glad that they're still here in person. There we have Mary Alice, and we have a real serenity. I mean, Mary Alice, you'll be talking to people about this later, I hope. But a serenity of the domestic scene, but then the canary is, our eyes are drawn to the canary. And then the real question, if you think about trifles in a historical context, and in the context of the play, the little bird that symbolizes beauty and music and creativity and life also could mean a protest and a warning. So, also here, Andrea Petito has also been inspired by trifles. So she has her artist, writer, and the bird is on the knee. So I'm hoping that you all will talk to us a little bit about that at some point. Okay. I just want to end this particular generation of people with a little quote by Hutch Hapgood. We're talking about the life in Provincetown, and we would float together in the evening in the most amiable way, sometime at Margaret's house, sometimes at Jig and Susan, sometimes at Mary's, sometimes at ours. We gathered early and would break up by midnight, having drunk just enough to loosen our tongues and free our imaginations. I don't believe it for a minute, but I think what he's doing. But now we have another group of people, and here I'm calling it disruption. And this is a generation born in the 1880s, just a few years later, but the 1880s, they're very different. They're a little bit younger, not much. They're adults. They have no children, so they're a little more fancy-free. They're a little more active and moving around the country and Europe back and forth, and they don't really do so much soul searching. And this is a photo that Louise Bryant sent to Jack Reed. Here they are again. In 1916, when they were at their first summer together in Provincetown. And the beach picture, the dune picture, he's away at conventions, covering a convention. He's a reporter, and she writes to him and she says, This is to remind you of all the months after the convention. Take care, honey. So she's tempting him to come home and also telling him to be on the straight and narrow there. But this is Louise Bryant, and she was born in San Francisco in 1885. She also lies about her age, so don't pay attention to that if you see it. And I'm calling her a disruptor because when you look at her, she is really, the 1916, she is really Mrs. Paul Trulinger, the wife of a dentist in Portland, Oregon, who really fell in love with Jack Reed when he came to Portland to visit his family. He's originally from Portland. And a few months after they meet and fall in this love, they must have had like firecrackers going off. She gets on a train. Trulinger, her husband, brings her violets for her trip. She arrives in New York City on the 4th of January and goes direct to live with Reed. The people in GV, the Greenwich Village, the bohemian crowd, they don't like her at all. They think she's a nobody from Portland. She's a society writer for a 2-bit newspaper in Portland. She's an opportunist. Dorothy Day, the future saint, who's around this crowd at the same time, said that they were just really jealous because she was so pretty. But I think what they really disliked about her was that she captivated the bohemian bad boy that everybody loved, and that was Jack Reed, and he's right in that picture. Okay. The two come to Provincetown in 1916, and they throw themselves into the Provincetown Players. They're writing plays, they're acting in other people's plays, they're acting in their own plays, and no one likes Louise in Provincetown either, not at all. And I think the reason they don't like her are maybe twofold. One, that she exposed the conflicts that they felt and didn't want to really express, because Louise, who was Mrs. Paul Trulinger, who was living with Jack Reed, takes up with Eugene O'Neill and flaunts it. And flaunts it. She does not hide it. She is open about it. And Reed is away often covering these news events, and she's with O'Neill all the time, and it's getting to be a scandal even among the free love crowd that really doesn't expect a woman to have so many lovers at the same time. That seems beyond the pale there. So, so what happens is they start to have rumors. Well, one story that they tell, and I think is true, that one of Reed's friends was staying in their house, 592 Commercial Street. In the middle of the night, they're in bed upstairs, and Fred, that's the friend, comes in, knocks on the door, and says, "I want $40." And Reed wakes up and says, like, "Why?" And he says, "I'm going to buy a gun." "And why are you going to buy a gun?" "Well, I'm going to buy a gun because Eugene O'Neill's been sleeping with Louise, and I'm going to go and kill him." And so what Reed does, according to the story, is he turns to Louise, he kisses her on the cheek, he says, "That's fine, go sleep it off, Fred. We won't worry about this." And the next day he goes over to O'Neill and he says, "I want you to come and have dinners with us for the next few weeks." So that's a story about the magnanimity of John Reed. But then there's the question of, it's not about Louise. The disapproval of Louise comes out in different rumors. One of the rumors is that she's going to bare her breasts in one of the plays. And the next fall, she has a gynecological something. I don't really know what it is, because no one can really pinpoint it. But the rumors about it. She's had an abortion and it's been botched. She has gonorrhea from Reed. No, she has tuberculosis from Eugene O'Neill. They don't like her for that, right? They just can't put their head around it, even though she is one of them and tries to be one of them, and that may be her other problem. She throws herself into the bohemian world and wants to be part of it, and they don't want it. When she writes her first play, one of the actors, one of the players, says, "Just because she's sleeping with Jack Reed is no reason we should do her play." So they're really nasty at her. And her play, which is called The Game, and it's It's a morality play. It's sort of a takeoff on a medieval morality play where life and death are throwing a die for the life of the young lover and the dancer, the youth and the young woman. And so it's really an interesting play. The people hated it. And not only did the people hate it then, for 100 years, the critics are saying it's an ordinary play. It's not much in itself. It's still an attempt at a parable. The only press it gets is because William and Marguerite Zurach did the stage setting. So you can see the modern stage setting. So when they look at it, people say, well, yes, it's okay because Louise gave them all the free hand to make this a really modernist play. It's only since like 2020 that people are beginning to get interested in the play as a play, and to see that it really is juxtaposing love and creativity against the slaughter of millions. And this was going on. This was 1916. This is what they're seeing in Europe. So there's a little bit of renewal of interest in the play as a play. But she still has not had any help with that. So now it comes to Louise, who's up here in Mark Goodman's Intermission, 1916, Louise and Charles. And I was saying, I find this really an interesting pictures because she's got a white dress on, and in her memoirs she talks about in the summer of 1916, the only thing she wore was a bathing suit and occasionally a white linen dress. And and then she's called Intermission, so it makes me think it's talking about intermission in a play. And but then I'm seeing her haircut, and her haircut, it's not really clear when she cut her hair, but I think it was probably around 1919 rather than 1916. And so all of this is suggesting that it's some future. And then it starts to make sense, because intermission can be a pause in a play, but it can also be a pause in a life. And so the Louise who goes to P-Town in 1916 is someone who really wants to belong. The Louise who after 1916, 1917, goes off to cover the war in France and goes to the front lines and sees it. And she comes back in August, and Reed meets her at the ship, and he says to her, get ready, 3 days we sail for Russia. So in late August, they sail off to Russia, and they're getting to Russia, if you can think about it, just at the time that the Tsar has been overthrown, that there is massive fighting in the streets between the moderates and the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and they are there during the time that Lenin sneaks in from Finland, and that the actual Bolsheviks take over the two big Soviets, the Soviet of Moscow and the Soviet of Petrograd. And they're there, and they're covering it, and they know these people, and they're interviewing them, and they have a beginning of a new life together, and of equals. They're both war correspondents, and during that time that they're there, she is going to write 6 red months in Russia, and he's going to write that famous 10 days that shook the world. So to me, intermission, by wearing the cape, the red cape, she was famous when she came back to the United States after her stint in Russia, being very pro-Russia, not necessarily pro-Bolshevik, but fighting against propaganda against Russia in the United States at the time. And this is 1919, this is the time of the Red Scare. This is the time where you had to have American flags flying. You could not carry a red flag. What she used to do when she was on the lecture circuit, she would wear a black cape and with a red lining. And when she got up on stage, she would open it. And it was a sign of her new self. And I think it's a new person, right? So for me, the intermission is the intermission of the play, but it's also the intermission in her life, and now she is her full person, and not now trying to meet up with the bohemians and fit into their mold. But one more person, and I think this is really interesting. Louise and Charles is the name of this painting, and you'd think it would be Louise and Eugene, wouldn't you? I mean, because that's the big scandal. But it's not. It's Charles. It's Charles Demuth. And Charles Demuth is a painter. He's not a writer. The only painter I have in this group. And he's summering in Provincetown in 14, 15, and perhaps 16. And he has a place in Greenwich Village too. And Demuth is interesting because he's very different than the other crowd that are hanging out in Provincetown. And an art critic, his critic, the one who really studies him, says that he has had a self-image as an outsider, a voyeur, outsider, a voyeur, someone never fully engaged with others. His biographer says that he is remote and ultimately opaque, and she gives the title of his biography Behind a Laughing Mask. And his friend says, Demuth was extremely vain and dressed extremely well. People always talk about his ties. He had a very nice collection of ties, and only the very best. At Provincetown, when everybody else was looking sloppy, Demuth would wear black shirt, I'm going to go back here, black shirt, white slacks, a plum-colored scarf around the waist, and black laced shoes, highly polished. He had a high squeaky voice and a high giggle that sounded like the whinny of a horse. So what I think these people are doing is giving us code words that were used by middle-class homosexual men who were looking for sex with other men. And that's a complicated sentence, but I'll just leave it at that for now. At a time when this was a very difficult period, a lot of legal and social punishment would be expected for them. But it's at the same time that a male homosexual middle-class culture is evolving. So Demuth is in some ways enigmatic. He is fully part of the Provincetown crowd. He stays at boarding houses. He's got friends who tease him. They call him Chuck because he's such a dandy. He helps Jane Cook and Susan Glasspool paint their house. He's a really good friend of Eugene O'Neill. Some of the women in Provincetown are crazy about him. So he's got a lot of people who are interested in him. And he's an active member of the Provincetown Players. And in 1915, he acts in a play, and he paints. And when they move to New York, he paints the interior of the theater. But he's got a private realm as well. So while he is in Provincetown, he's mostly known for his watercolors. He's doing this kind of watercolor of the bay, but he's also doing other kinds of art in watercolor. And one of the things are illustrations from late 19th century novels, what we call the decadent literature, usually books with a lot of sexual violence, and sexual difference going on in them. And he would do watercolors, not for the books, for himself. And his gallery, the gallery who showed his work, would not show it on the walls. They had to know that he had them, and you had to go and ask for it, and they would only go to connoisseurs. He also starts to do a whole series of watercolors on places that he likes to frequent. And they're usually places where non-normative behavior, non-normative sexual behavior was really rampant. One would be vaudeville, because vaudeville had always drag, impersonators. They always had drag in American vaudeville, was a feature of it, in fact. Circuses, and baths. And this is from his Turkish bath series, and he's got several of them. And this is a study of them. People think this is the Lafayette Bath, which is in Greenwich Village. And it is one of the few bathhouses it's a gay bathhouse. So men would go there primarily for sex with other men, but also make friends. And the people who do studies of the Lafayette, they talk about how it was really important for a community of middle-class men who could not meet outside of sort of protected space to make friends. And they have lifelong friends. But this is one of his three, and he often has three figures. And in this case, you have the man with the towel around, or the sheet around his shoulders, that's sort of keeping you from seeing what's going on in that conversation. And that is also something that he, from this series, is the masseuse. And generally what I wanted to bring up, that one of his disruption is that he is eroticizing the male body and then focusing on the pleasures of male touching men in the masseuse. And you can see that he tends to use the red wash to highlight the buttocks of the fellow being massaged. And he uses that red wash also to call our attention to what's going on. So he is, I think, someone who's really interesting. He's later in his 1930s, he becomes much more explicit, but I'm bringing him up as a disruptor because he really does make a space in what is primarily a heterosexual bohemian community for homoerotic desire and for the position of homosexual men. So he has a public self and a private self. So that is so all I'm going to say right now. I hope we get some conversation. My takeaway is that these people lived at a time of possibility. And we can follow, because they do use their creativity in words and in paint to express what they were feeling. We can actually understand what they lived like in a way that for many people has been lost. And at the same time, they have, after 1914, 1916, and then 1919, pivotal moments of U.S. Attention to World War I and post-World War I. It's a time when all their dreams were shown to be crumbling. So I think one of the legacies that I take is that always looking for their legacies. What did they leave us? What did we learn? What did they leave us? So, thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll ask questions of me, of the artist, comments.
It was wonderful. That's my comment.
It was fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, good. I liked it. Yeah.
I don't know whether several of the artists here, I know Paul is not tonight, but the question is, for example, the painting back there with the bird, very, very political in orientation, depending on these stories. How did the artists who created that, I don't know if any of them were here or who that is.
She's
Okay,
here.
so glad you're here. How did you come to this subject matter? Because you could paint 100 different things, and when I look at Paul's work too, about with the door, so there seemed to be a very strong cultural and literary influence in
Well,
your
what
art.
happened was, several years ago, I had a friend who discovered Susan Glasgow, and she came. We spent a week up in Truro together painting. It's a bunch of women artists, and she was very excited, and she said, I have a videotape of a play that I want you all to watch. And it was a video of the play Trifles. And so we watched it, and it was very interesting. It was riveting, actually, and I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I kept thinking, I think I see paintings in this philosophy, in this play, and I kind of let it go behind me, and I went and did other things, and then Helen came with the Beyond Bohemia, and Susan Glasgow grabbed me again and said, hey, let's talk about Trifles. And so I thought, yeah, I want to explore this. She performed in this play in 1916. She wrote the play more than 100 years ago. She performed in it 100 years ago, and it is still so relevant today. Everything about it. And so I just started with the kernel of the idea that I wanted to explore the relevancy. I wanted to explore what the trifles were. So I peopled the painting with things that would be considered trifles. A little lamp, a couple of tea towels, a cupboard with some indistinct glasses or teacups, curtains, a painting, a bucket in a early 19th century kitchen. And I wanted to make her look like she was in Provincetown in the summer, so I put a white dress on her. But the whole painting had to center around the canary. So everything else is light and airy, and the canary is black and ominous, because the canary had a very important part to play. So that's how it came. It was just pieced together from feelings I had from watching the play.
What about you, Mark? That one. How did you come up with the Susan Glasswood House the Move?
Should, I mean, Ellen, do you want to
Yeah,
go
I was
first and then
just
I'll do that?
gonna ask
And then
Mary
we'll ask you.
Jane how you work together with the artist.
I didn't.
She didn't, she just looked at the pieces, right?
I looked at, yes, I wanted to do something on the people that I knew that, who lived in Provincetown. And I saw these and they just stood out to me. And I said, I can give you a historical background. I can't give you, this is also the Mary Heaton Vorse House. And I don't think that's got a historical story, at least for me. I couldn't add something. But these I thought, well, maybe I can add something to people if they have a little bit of the past of this. Yeah.
So, actually, just before you speak, because I just want to go back to my painting of
And just so everyone knows, that's now hanging in the Mary Heaton Vorse House.
yeah, that's why I said
That's why it's not here.
yeah, so I kind of did the opposite of what Mary Alice did. So I was interested in the play. I read the play. I haven't seen it on on video or anything. And I kind of set her up almost the way I was inspired actually by Whistler's Mother, because it's a very gray and black composition. Nice composition. She had a white. I put that white blouse. But the canary is the one spot of color. It's bright yellow. It's perched on her knee. And my thought was that it was the muse. So it's just a different role for the canary. And it's kind of it's kind of a negative version of what Mary Alice did.
But it would have been what Minnie, the role, would have wanted. She wanted the canary to bring the life and the music
Yes,
to her.
the music. She
to her
loved
dismal
the
household.
canary singing.
Yeah.
So so in that painting, the canary is the muse.
Mark,
you're
what was the question? What was the question?
The question is, how did he come up with that one?
Oh.
Well, I loved what you said, that you looked at these paintings to try to add something to it, and you certainly did. For me, I made the characters actually flesh them out for me and made me understand them a little bit more, especially the Charles DeMuth character in that. So this actually just came out from just a little paragraph in the Shores of Bohemia book that just described the scene where Louise was at the premiere of Eugene O'Neill's play, Lisa Picard, and I believe that she actually, it was like a double bill with her play. I think that's referenced in that. And she was there, and it described that she was wearing a red cape and a white linen dress, and also there were Charles DeMuth and his friend Marsden Hartley, and they were described, they pretty vividly described as Charles DeMuth.
His family calls himself DeMuth, and he go on to call himself Demuth. But the interesting thing about the Charles DeMuth Foundation, and it's connected to the Lancaster the Lancaster Historical Museum or Art Museum. In 2022, they got grant money to do the full past experience, and they have started to do work on digging up his sort of homosexual societies that he grew up with and people he knew and what he did that had been really kept quiet. Actually, some of his more erotic paintings from the 30s were not sold. They were privately owned or then given away. They weren't really seen until probably the 50s, I think, some of them. And it's in 2022 that the foundation decided that they're going to unleash this and start looking at it and talking about it. And if you go to the Charles DeMuth Foundation on the web, you can get in, read the articles and see some of the things that they're doing. So it's really quite surprising that the game is now being rethought as a better, sort of a modernist painting, everything's sort of coming again.
And I think Ned's gonna show us one that Mary Jane hasn't even seen yet, also by Mark. It's called Bass.
Oh, it's like the
Which I did years before, and because it is a classic subject of paintings, but it described the way you described his paintings. This has a lot of the same.
Very similar.
So I was kind of surprised by that. But yeah.
Great.
But going back to that painting, what I was interested in these two characters in particular was this. Louise is described as having living with John Reed, Jack Reed, having this affair with Eugene O'Neill, and then also still being married. Okay, that's.
She was getting a divorce, like he was getting a divorce.
But still, she had a lot. She was.
She had affairs with other people too.
Yeah. She had a lot going on, but it was also this part of this idea of women trying to find their sexual power and liberation and being able to live like men.
Get out of the birdcage.
And then, so that was interesting to me, but also, Charles Demuth being known as being there with his other out gay friend, at least in Provincetown. Marston Hartley was not as out about
I
it.
don't know if they would call it out, but
Well,
outish.
in terms of
Outish.
being the dandy walking around, I mean, people knew. People knew. But also, I find it interesting. Like, we think all this freedom that we're trying to have in Provincetown, that people still go to Provincetown for, and a lot of it has to do with sexual liberation and freedom. And people were addressing that stuff, trying to emerge from that. We're in a period now that's being a little pushed back on, and all that. And so I thought I originally had three people, another man in that painting, the Charles, Marston Hartley, but it seemed more, the contrast of just the two of them seemed stronger to me.
Yeah,
And,
it is.
And just, again, this idea that they're dealing with things that we still are trying to deal with.
100 years ago.
Over 100 years ago.
Or more.
Yeah.
So that's why I picked the subject.
I think it was really interesting that Charles, the way you drew, painted Charles, it's similar. He does not put a lot of faces.
Yeah.
He keeps that sort of blurry, and you did too. And I don't know, did you do that on purpose?
I did it because I wanted the Louise Bryant to be the star of the painting.
Right.
But what saw him as adding this sort of sexual undertones to the painting. That he's seems to me, in my mind, he was flirting perhaps with someone. There's something. We don't know who there's still a shadow of that other figure there. So to me, it's like taking that break. There's the stance, the way he's up against the wall. It adds just a little bit of the sort of mysterious, and a little bit of
And he's
sexual
watching.
And the
energy.
purple sash.
Yeah, the purple sash.
But that was from the description. Like he
That was
literally
a
was wearing.
description of by a friend.
Now we know why.
Her expression is
So I think it's probably, if there are no more big questions, another question?
Well, only because I fall down rabbit holes. Once you give me one little fact, I have no rabbit holes. So I think you said that she was at the Lawrence riots, or in 1912.
Yes.
So she lived in Sheridan Square in 1911.
No, she lived in Sheridan Square about 18. She married.
Oh,
18,
before, okay.
Yeah, she marries 1898. She lives in Sheridan Square like 1899.
The one thing I was going to say is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factories in 1911, which I think led to the Lawrence riots, etc., and was this huge tragedy. If she lived in the area, she could easily have been.
She was on Waverly Place, I believe.
Oh yeah,
Time
so
of the-
close.
And she actually heard the bells of fire engines going.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Do you
You can
think
change the world.
it brought about some new laws and hopefully?
Well, I think it
change
was
her-
something that people like her could rally around and understand finally what that
Yes.
really meant.
Yes. Yes. I think we're being called by Bacchus and Sappho.
Thank you.
Jane would tell us to do that.
Thank you.